Economic policy through the lens of history. Welcome to this video where we'll have a look over the history of Keynesian economics and when did it fail in the history. This is going to be really a deep dive into classical economics and Keynesian economics. We will see how it has briefly impacted in the history and in the past. So, before we start, subscribe to our channel where we talk about money and how you can make it in real ways. So, in the year 2008, the world experienced a financial crisis. In the space of a month, the stock market lost 40% of its value and the world entered the worst recession since the 1930s. The US unemployment rate went from 4.5% to 10%. Between September 2008 and September 2009, the economy lost 500,000 jobs a month. Following the 2008 crisis, there was a fierce debate between classical economists like Eugene Fama of University of Chicago and Robert Barrow of Harvard. Classical and Keynesian ideas have been actively debated by the economists for 70 years. When one side or the other gains more credibility, the effect on all of our lives is substantial. Policymakers are guided by the economic theories. In the 1990s, classical economists argued that markets should be given a free check. Their ideas led to the deregulation of financial markets in the late 1990s. Classical ideas ascended for 30 years, beginning in 1970 and ending with the onset of financial crisis in 2008. In response to the 2008 crisis, the pendulum of the economic ideas has swung back towards regulation. Policymakers in the administration are influenced by the ideas of the English economist, that is, John Maynard Keynes. Keynes argued that free markets need to be controlled and that the big corporates should be held responsible for ensuring that everyone who wants a job has the one. So, why is there such disagreement among economists, businessmen, and entrepreneurs about economics? Who are the classical and Keynesian economists and what did they say? The economic history of the past 100 years can be divided into three periods, each guided by one of the two different economic theories, that is classical and Keynesian economics. Before 1930, the classical economics was dominant. In the period from 1946 to 1976, classical ideas were replaced by a new theory, that is Keynesian economics. From 1976 through 2008, classical economics once again more gained the upper hand. The swing from classical to Keynesian economics and back again to classical ideas was driven by historical events. The rise of capitalist free market economics in the mid-18th century led to dramatically improved living standards, and Scottish economist Adam Smith developed classical economics to explain the remarkable success. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, capitalism failed in a spectacular way as the unemployment rate in the United States climbed to 24%. This failure of free markets to deliver prosperity led to the rejection of the classical economic theory and the development of alternative set of the ideas to explain what had gone wrong, which led to Keynesian economics. From the end of the World War II through the mid-1970s, most economics were Keynesians. But during the 1970s, Keynesian economics itself came under attack when it failed to explain how high inflation and unemployment could coincide as they did at the end of that decade. Economists retreated to classical ideas which they reformulated using mathematics. By that time, the Great Depression had been forgotten and faith in the free markets was once again in the dominant view. All that changed in the 2008 when the financial crisis of epic proportions reminded us that market economics could sometimes go spectacularly wrong. The 2008 recession caused the economic theorists once again to rethink the positions. Now, we are likely to enter a new era that draws on ideas from both schools of thought. Capitalism began in 16th century in Europe. It was made possible by a new legal institution, the joint stock company, which allowed many people to pool their resources in large-scale ventures while limiting the liability if the venture failed. The first joint stock company in England was Muscovy Company, created by Royal Charter in 1555. Although it wasn't until the 18th century that the capitalism really began to flourish. Capitalism was accompanied by the rise of economic liberalism. Economic liberalism is the idea that the free exchange of goods in the markets makes everybody better off. By the American Revolution in 1776, liberal ideas were dominant. Economic liberalism led to the modern system of production whereby individuals are free to buy and sell goods in markets in pursuit of profit. In 1776, the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith penned an inquiry into the nature and causes of wealth of nations, and thus the science of economics was born. Before the advent of capitalism, there was very little improvement in living standards. The lifestyle of the average person in Roman times 2000 years ago was not very different from that of a peasant in 15th century in England. Although the rulers of Rome lived in a relative luxury, as did the kings of England, even the poorest person in the advanced society today enjoys many luxuries that would have been given to Roman societies. Since the inception of capitalism in 16th century Europe, income per person has grown at a bit less than 2% per year. And as a consequence, the standard of living of the average person has doubled every 35 years. The power of compound growth is staggering. By fostering this growth, capitalism has been responsible for pulling more human beings on this planet out of misery than any other known form of social organization. Yet, capitalism is not a huge, massive relating concept. Free exchange cannot happen without a legal system that clearly defines how contracts will be enforced. Ever since the inception of capitalism, a fierce debate has raged between those who favor more or less regulation of free markets. On the one hand, classical economics believe that more often than not, unregulated markets work well. On the other, Keynesian economists believe that it is responsibility of the big companies to intervene in the markets to make sure all are employed. Although capitalism delivers growth, it does not deliver steady growth. Sometimes growth softly explodes, and when it does, many people lose their jobs at the same time. When growth falls temporarily, we say that the economy is in recession. There have been 10 recessions since World War II, and most of them have been relatively mild. But sometimes recession can be very deep. When this happens, many people begin to question the ability of capitalism to deliver prosperity. When a crisis occurs, democracies evolve new institutions to help combat the crisis. A good example of this is the development of central banks like the Bank of England in United Kingdom or the Federal Reserve System in United States. Central banks were created to cope with a series of financial panics very similar to the current crisis that occurred during the 19th century. In the US, deep recessions were accompanied by the bank failures in 1819 and 1893. As we saw in 2008, when a nation's financial system fails, it pulls the whole economy down. To help prevent the disastrous effects of financial crisis, the English economist Walter Bagehot wrote a book in 1873 called Lombard Street, in which he outlined the principles of effective central banking. Lombard Street was London's financial centre and the 19th century equivalent of Wall Street today. The 1920s was a period of remarkable prosperity in the United States, much like the 1990s and early 2000s. President Calvin Coolidge fiercely defended free markets. All of this suddenly came to an end when the stock market fell by 24% in 2 days in October 1929. By 1933, the market had lost 84% of its value. Shortly after the stock market crash, unemployment began to climb. By 1933, 24% of the labor force was without a job. The immense human misery of this period gave rise to the deep distrust of capitalism. In response to this failure of the free market, the English economist John Maynard Keynes wrote an important book that is a general theory of employment, interest, and money, published in 1936. This book changed the world. Before the general theory, the idea that the corporate has the responsibility to provide jobs was almost unheard of. After the publication, it became widespread. In 1946, it passed the Employment Act, which gave the new responsibility of the maintenance of full employment. Capitalist economics have been subjected to repeat cycles of prosperity and depression ever since the 17th century. Classical economics developed theories of this why these cycles occur. In 1928, the English economist Arthur wrote an important book on the topic called industrial fluctuations. Arthur listed at least 6 different causes of business cycles, that is, industrial disputes, agricultural shocks caused by the bad weather, monetary disturbances, changes in taste of invention of new technologies, and shocks to consumer and business confidence. The Norwegian economist Ragnar Frisch provided a physical model that further captures this classical vision. Blows from the club represent economic shocks. An airline pilot strike, an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, or the invention of the computer are significant blows. If the rocking horse were no longer hit with these blows, it would quickly come to rest. Similarly, if the economy were no longer hit with the shocks, the free market would quickly restore full employment. As a direct result of his real life experience of the depression, Keynes disagreed with the classical vision. Instead, he introduced what I consider to be the two most important new ideas. He argued that the labor market does not work well and that without a little help, very high unemployment can persist forever. Second, he argued that the rate of unemployment is determined by the beliefs of participants in the financial markets. Keynes' theory linked the stock market with the labor market. In his view, loss of confidence by the investors caused the Great Depression. When the businessmen and the women lost confidence in the economy, they stopped buying new machines and factories. The firms that produced factories and machines laid off workers. And when workers lost their jobs, they stopped spending, and that reduction in purchasing power caused more layoffs in other industries. Keynes' vision of the economy was very different from Frisch's characterization of classical economics. The economy is like a sailboat on the ocean without a broken rudder. Gusts of wind represent economic shocks. If the winds die down, a sailboat can become becalmed on the ocean. In the same way, if the economy was no longer blown by economic winds, the free market could leave it with the unemployment rate of 5%, 10%, or 20%. From 1946 until the mid 1970s, the rise of Keynesian ideas directly influenced economic policy. Since public spending is more stable than private spending, this helped dampen business cycles, which were 4 times less volatile after World War II than before. By reducing the volatility of business cycles, intervention in the economy prevented large increases in the unemployment during recessions. After World War II, central banks throughout the world began to intervene actively to combat recessions. In every one of the 10 post-war recessions, the Federal Reserve lowered the interest rate at the beginning of each recession to help stimulate private demand. The use of interest rate changes to control recessions is called monetary policy. Fiscal and monetary policy worked well to keep unemployment low from 1946 through 1976. But at the same time, there was a steady increase in inflation. By 1975, it has reached 11% per year, while the unemployment rate was at 8%, a very high number by post-war standards. Inflation is a steady increase in the average price of goods. It was not a problem during the Great Depression, and instead, contemporary economists were concerned about deflation, a situation of falling prices. Keynes thought that the inflation would only occur if the economy were operating at full employment. He built this idea into the new theory he wrote in the 1936 book. Yet the coincidence of inflation and the unemployment does occur. We call this stagflation. Because stagflation cannot occur in Keynesian theory, economists gave up on the Keynes, and the pendulum of ideas swung back to classical thought from 1979 to 2009. Economics is a science, but it is not an experimental science. We cannot disrupt the lives of millions of people to find out if one policy works better than another. Instead, we must wait for time to experiment for us, and the Great Depression and the occurrence of the stagflation were two experiments that helped economists refine their ideas. The 2008 financial crisis is the third. The 2008 crisis has been disruptive to economic theory because it has reminded us that free markets can fall in a spectacular way. Once again, policymakers are looking to Keynesian remedies, but the ideas of Keynes' general theory are not enough to help us now because his ideas do not explain this stagflation we experienced in 1970s. Instead, economists are developing new ideas that put together Keynesian and classical ideas. In the past, we developed institutions to help markets function smoothly. The Federal Reserve System was created to deal with 19th century financial crisis. The use of active fiscal and monetary policy evolved from the experiences in the Great Depression. Stagflation in 1970 also led to the change as the central bankers created a new policy called inflation targeting to help deal with inflation. In each of the previous episodes of Change, academic economics developed new theories to explain the failure of the old. The 2008 crisis, like its predecessors, is likely to lead not just to the birth of new ideas but also to the new policies to guide our economy into the next century. Thus, we have come to the end of this video, and if you like it, subscribe to our channel for more videos and hit the bell for the notifications.